Remember how I shared that we were going to create a dedicated space just for sewing? Well, this week we made a ton of changes and improvements to the sewing room, and I am so excited to share them with you. The very first thing I wanted to do in the sewing room was paint it. So as you can see, it's kind of just a boring white, and I'm not about that. So we got everything off the walls and patched up all the holes to get it ready to paint. So for the color, I knew I wanted to go with something really, really bright. And I honestly have been really missing the paint color from my shop. So if you are new around here, I used to be a full-time Etsy seller, and I had my own little shop, and we painted it this bright pink, and I have been missing that color so much. And I kept telling my husband, I'm like, I'm gonna paint one room pink. I need to paint one room pink. And so whenever we decided to do the sewing room, I knew that this room would be perfect. So I actually did one shade darker than I did in my shop. So my shop was Pink Bangles by Valspar, and this is Warm Pink by Valspar. So I knew I wanted it to have a little more punch than my shop, and so I just went one shade more pink than it used to be. I also wanted to change the layout in the sewing room, and so I decided that the embroidery table and the shelving unit should be switched. And then when I made that decision, I decided a way bigger rug could fit in here, and I really liked this green rug that I found online. And so I swapped both of those things, and then we got all the fixtures, well, not all of them, but the curtains at least, back up, and the sewing room was ready to be organized. Now, before we get to the organizing of the sewing room, I wanted to share with you guys what a really typical breakfast morning routine looks like around our house. So first things first, I am heavily addicted to coffee. I shouldn't say that, but I definitely do get a headache if I don't have it. And so we always do espresso when we are at home. And so my favorite way to prepare it is just with a double shot of espresso, coconut milk, because I can't do dairy, and so that's like the healthiest, best milk in my opinion, ground cinnamon and maple syrup, and just to have it iced. That is definitely my favorite way to have a latte. And then we always do a really simple breakfast. We are not complicated breakfast people, and so that usually just looks like a sausage patty, slice of toast, and a couple eggs. It's really that simple for us at breakfast time. After we got breakfast, ate, and cleaned up, I went straight back into the sewing room to work on it more. So the first thing I wanted to do was switch out the green curtains because I didn't feel like they let enough light in. And so I had these more sheer white curtains on hand, and they worked perfectly for what I was trying to accomplish. The biggest organizing job I needed to tackle in my sewing room was sorting my fabric. Now, I don't actually have like a huge stash of fabric for like most sewers do, but I do still have enough. And to be honest with you, it was not organized in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it was just looked pretty. It was not organized at all before, and so I was really starting from zero. And so I knew that that was going to be a big job and kind of like the biggest organizing job I had to do. And so that is what I tackled first. I listen to a podcast every week about sewing and fashion. It's called Seamwork Radio, and I love it. And those ladies did an episode about organizing your sewing space, and they recommended sorting your fabric by weight. And I loved that idea, and so that's what I decided I was going to do. And so I was actually able to break my fabric into 5 different categories. So I did sort of what I would consider bottom weight, which is like canvas, kind of more heavyweight stuff. And then I had quilting cotton. I have tons of quilting cotton. And so I did a whole section just for quilting cotton. And then I also have a lot of Robert Kaufman Essex linen. And so I did one section for that. And then I have a few more lighter weight fabrics. And then my last category was dedicated just to linen tablecloths. So I have thrifted about 4 or 5 linen tablecloths throughout time, and they are all just white and beautiful, and so they needed their own section. Once I got my fabric back on the shelving unit, I started working on the other things that were on there, which just includes like my mending piles, some stuff dedicated for thrift flips, the scrap bin, all that kind of stuff, and also some tools. And so I gained a lot of space whenever I added this work table in and the embroidery table, and so I wanted to reorganize where I kept all of my tools, and also I needed to go through them as well. My bobbins were in a tangled mess, and so I needed to get those under control, so I got some of these rings in some cute colors. And then also I needed to find a new spot for my tape measures because they used to hang behind the door and I got rid of all those hooks, and so obviously I needed a new spot for those. And then lastly, I like to keep a clear acrylic tray of tools that I use all the time while I'm sewing, and I need to go through that because it was getting very, very cluttered. And the reason why I like to keep the tray is that I can pull it out from the center of my desk and keep it all the time while I'm sewing. It is so handy. I sorted through all of my notions and kind of more organized them, but they actually ended up in the exact same containers in the exact same spot that they were before, because ultimately I decided that that was just the handiest place for them to be. The very last thing on my sewing room organization to-do list was to sort through my threads. So I have a ton of thread. I have bought and collected stuff from the thrift store and estate sales over time. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, I used to have an embroidery shop. And so obviously for that, I had a ton of thread as well. Even though embroidery thread is quite different, you can sew with embroidery thread, but you can't embroider with sewing thread, or I guess all-purpose thread, if that makes any sense. And so I knew I needed to organize my thread. The very first thing I did was sort it by color so that I could put them on these new thread stands that I got in color-coded order, just to make them, 1, look really pretty, and 2, be easier to find the color that I needed when I needed it. And once all the organizing and painting was done, I wanted to christen the new sewing room by sewing a new pattern, or I guess new to me pattern. The pattern I wanted to try out is from Peppermint Magazine. They do a quarterly free pattern, and this one was their Peplum Tank. I have been wanting to try this pattern for a while, but I actually have not been wanting to make it in the form of a tank top. I wanted to use the pattern for the bodice and then make the bottom of the tank top into a dress. And it looked like it would be really, really easy to do because the bottom of the tank was just 2 rectangles, and so I knew I could just take them all the way down. And so that was definitely an easy enough sew for someone even as a beginner as me to make. Now, this was obviously my first time making this pattern, and so I really had no idea how it was going to fit. I decided to cut out size F, which in hindsight was definitely too big. But my plan for this pattern and for this make was to make what I considered a wearable muslin before I cut into like more expensive fabric. So I pulled one of the pretty quilting cottons off of my shelf because it was just sitting there. They're not the best for apparel and they're pretty cheap. And I knew that if it did turn out that I could still wear it and just kind of wear it around casually, even though it might not be the best fabric for garments, I could test the pattern with it. So that was my goal with this. I personally think that sewing is one of the best ways to embrace a slower lifestyle or even just the slow season of winter, even if you're not sewing for winter, because there is nothing to make you realize how quick and fast paced our world is than to sew your own garment. It is crazy the amount of work that goes into any garment. And if you've ever made one, you obviously know this. And I just have to remind myself that even though it is more efficient and cheaper and all that kind of stuff, that same amount of work is going into the garments that we can buy really, really quickly on Amazon. And so there is just nothing like embracing slowness and the way that your goods get to you and all that kind of stuff than to try and make them yourself. And so I really, really appreciate that about sewing, and I remind myself that while I'm sewing, because sometimes some extra steps, even like making a muslin, just seem like they are so slow and such a drag. And I tell myself that if the goal was to get a garment quickly, sewing was never the answer in the first place. And so that is one of the reasons why I do love to sew, especially in the winter, is to embrace that slow season and also appreciate more where all of our stuff comes from. This mindset allows me to embrace every part of creating the garment and take extra time to press slowly and serge each seam open and all that kind of stuff. And I really, really do enjoy it. By the end of the first day sewing this, I had the bodice together. So I had the front panel, the back panel attached to the shoulder panel. And then I also was able to get the armholes bound. I did not get the neck holes bound, but I did have the armholes bound by the end of the first day that I was working on this project. Okay, it is the next morning and I finished binding up the armholes of the top of the bodice last night. And then I tried it on and it was definitely way too wide through here. And so I'm gonna have to figure out how to adjust the pattern in order to make that not happen. Obviously, this is why we make prototypes before we cut into expensive fabrics, but I just thought I'd give you guys a little update. So what I'm gonna do now before I finish this up, because I do wanna finish this just because it's cute enough to where if it fits decent, I'll wear it throughout the summer. And then I'll definitely figure out how to adjust the pattern on the next go round. But I'm gonna toss it in the wash because I didn't actually pre-wash this fabric. I'm gonna finish the neckline, toss it in the wash, see what happens with the fit then, and then I'm going to finish up the dress and modify the pattern. Now, binding a neck hole with bias tape, especially a neck hole that has a V-neck in it, is something that I learned I want to practice more because that was very difficult and I'm not very good at it. And so I would love to practice that more. And all that to say, I did not get the neck hole bound before I needed to go upstairs and make lunch because I felt like I was neglecting my home duties. And so I got as far as I could, and then I knew I had to go upstairs and make lunch. Now, for lunch that day, I decided on a classic for my family, which is pizza soup. And so it is honestly just like it sounds, where you basically add almost all the ingredients that you would add to a pizza to a soup, and then it makes a very, very tasty, unique soup, and a good way to get some broth in and some veggies in. And also this was on a weekend, and so I was able to then snack on those leftovers all week. So the main protein of this meal is mild Italian sausage, but you can also add pepperoni as well. We never do. I don't really know why. I should definitely start doing that. And then also you get in some veggies. So once you have the sausage cooked, you set it aside, and then you soften all of your veggies. So your onion, your bell pepper, mushrooms, if you have them, garlic. And then once those are softened, you can add in pizza sauce and some broth. Obviously, add in some good Italian spices. And I do nutritional yeast because I have a dairy sensitivity, and so that just kind of helps it taste like cheese. But if you don't have a dairy allergy, I definitely recommend just adding mozzarella cheese on top, because that would taste way better. Like I said, this recipe stays a steady part of our winter rotation, our soup season rotation, just because it shakes it up and kind of steers away from the typical veggie soup. And we love this. It's very filling and very tasty. We always get seconds when we make this. After lunch, I headed back down to the sewing room to sew down the neck hole binding so that I could get it in the wash. And while it was washing, I decided that this dress would be really, really easy to add pockets to. And so I printed out a free pocket template from Rosary Apparel and cut out four pieces in 2 pairs so that I could add those whenever the dress was done washing. Okay, washing the bodice totally worked for the fit. It shrunk down to where it like fits really well now. But I do now feel as though I did not accomplish the goal of having a muslin and realizing how the pattern works. So I feel like I have to make it again. But honestly, I've been kind of wanting to get a pattern and get really good at it, just to practice my skills, just use the same pattern over and over and over again, because that's what One Girl I Follow recommends doing when you're learning how to sew. And so I don't feel as though I accomplished totally nailing down what I need to do to make the pattern fit me perfectly, but this will be a cute dress. So I'm gonna finish it, add on the skirt, add on the pockets, and it'll be done. Now, even though I did not accomplish my goal 100%, like I said, I'm still very, very happy with how this turned out and how much I learned throughout the process of making this. I learned that I don't really love the way quilting cotton works or looks for gathered skirts, and so I will definitely be using a lighter weight fabric for these types of projects in the future, and I will use my quilting cottons for more structured garments or garments that just don't have a lot of gathers. I also realized that I would like to learn more about how to take proper measurements and how to perform adjustments on a pattern if necessary. And so I will probably be researching that on YouTube in the future, because I definitely think I need to learn how to do that. And I sort of already mentioned this earlier in this video, but I also would really like to seek out patterns that use neck hole bindings and armhole bindings, because that is a skill that I definitely feel like I can get better at and would like to work on more. Overall, I am really happy with how the dress turned out, and I want to say thank you for joining me on the process of making it and sewing it and learning new things with me. So thank you so much for watching this, and I will see you guys in the next video.